Do you know the love of Christ? How long in your word, and how the word Bible considers this thing? Do you know the love of Christ?
It's a real pleasure to be back here with you in Duluth. Count, I think this is the fifth time that it has been my privilege to come here and visit this congregation. My wife was not able to come with me. Her mother, as many of you know, has Alzheimer's disease, and my wife is the primary caregiver. But she wanted me to be sure to convey to you her warmest love and greetings, and she was quite willing to share me and let me come this weekend. I'm grateful for that. You know, to begin, I don't imagine that you can see this, but it's a photograph. It's a photograph that I've been carrying in my wallet for over 28 years. And I've gone through several wallets in that time, and this photograph survived into each wallet. Now, the wallet that I have at present has enough of those plastic holders to accommodate about 8 photographs. And of the hundreds and hundreds of photographs that I could have chosen in the last 28 years, I've chosen to carry this one, among others. When your choices are limited, you would choose the photos that are dearest to you. Incidentally, this happens to be our wedding photo. And if you promise not to laugh, I would be happy to show it to you. And it occurs to me that Jehovah has done something similar with respect to his dear Son. You see, the gospel accounts in the Bible contain a number of verbal snapshots of Jesus. Now, Jehovah could not include everything. He could not include everything that Jesus said and did. The world itself could not contain the scrolls written, said the Apostle John. So that means that of everything that Jesus said and did, Jehovah had to select certain snapshots to include in his word. What then can we say about the ones he chose? Clearly, these must be the accounts that are dearest to Jehovah. The accounts that give us the clearest possible picture of his dear Son. Now, why did Jehovah include these accounts in the Bible? Well, the reason is indicated in our theme text, which is found at Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 19. Jehovah selected certain accounts and put them in his word for the reason we note here, Ephesians 3:19. It says, so that we can come to know the love of the Christ, which surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness that God gives. So Jehovah included the accounts about Jesus that are now found in the Bible because he wanted to teach us about Christ's love. Now, the words here, to know, translate a Greek verb that literally can mean to know something by experience. You cannot fully know someone's feelings unless, in some way, you experience them for yourself. Just to illustrate, a mother might try explaining to her 10-year-old daughter what it feels like to love as only a mother can love. Now, try as that 10-year-old girl will, she cannot fully comprehend her mother's love. If that little girl grows up someday, marries, and has a baby of her own, when she holds her own baby in her arms, then, by experience, she will know the love that her mother had for her. Similarly, you see, Jehovah wants us to know what Jesus felt when he showed love to others. But we can't grasp those feelings fully unless we experience them for ourselves. You see, when you show love to others the way Jesus did, only then can you begin to comprehend his feelings. See, only then, by experience, you come to know the love that Christ has for others. So in our discussion here this morning, we're going to take a look at a few of the snapshots of that love in action that Jehovah included in the Gospels. And we'll analyze each of these with a view to seeing how we can imitate Jesus in showing love to others. And when we do, then, by experience, the love of the Christ. The first example is found at Luke chapter 7. This is very appropriate, I think, this particular weekend, in view of the death of our dear prophet. But this account at Luke chapter 7 illustrates how Jesus' love moved him to ease the grief of others. Now, let's look at this snapshot of that love in action. Luke chapter 7. We'll start with verse 11. Now, the setting, this is the first resurrection performed by Jesus. It took place about halfway through Jesus' ministry when he approached the outskirts of the Galilean city of Nain. Luke chapter 7, and we'll start with verse 11. Consequently, following this, he traveled to a city called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd were traveling with him. As he got near the gate of the city, why, look, there was a dead man being carried out, the only begotten son of his mother. Besides, she was a widow. A considerable crowd from the city was also with her. And when the Lord caught sight of her, he was moved with pity for her, and he said to her, "Stop weeping." With that, he approached and touched the bier, and the bearer stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." And the dead man sat up and started to speak, and he gave him to his mother. Let's analyze the account closely. You notice in verse 12, it says that the dead man was the only begotten son of this woman, and that his mother was a widow. And what that tells us is that this was an especially sad funeral procession. Because once before, that woman had walked a funeral procession, that of her husband. But this time it was different. It was her son, her only son, her only child, and very likely her only means of support. It says, too, in verse 12, a considerable crowd was with them. In the first century, funeral processions were something to behold because a crowd of people would accompany the bereaved family members. It may have involved even professional mourners, musicians playing mournful tunes. There evidently was a considerable group of people walking along with this woman and the bier carrying the body of her dead son. In verse 13, it says, the Lord caught sight of her. Whether she was walking in front of the funeral bier or behind it is difficult to say. Because according to the Talmud, in certain areas in Israel, the men walked in front, the women walked behind. And depending upon where you lived in the land, in Galilee, for example, it said the men walked in the front. In Judea, the men walked behind. Wherever the men were, the women were in the opposite position. We don't know exactly where she was, but undoubtedly she was walking close to the bier, carrying the body of his son. And Jesus' gaze became fixed on that grief-stricken mother. Now, Jesus was touched by what he saw. Because it says in verse 13 that he was moved with pity. I think the last time I was here, we talked a little bit about this word in Greek that translates into moved with pity. Those three words in English translate one Greek word, which is said to be the strongest word in Greek for the feeling of compassion. And in the Bible, apart from its use in a couple of illustrations, this word is used to describe the feelings of only one person and that person is Jesus. And Jesus deeply felt for this woman. Why? It's interesting to think, perhaps Jesus saw his mother in that woman. For he knew that before long he himself would die, and that his mother would come to know what it feels like to lose her firstborn, beloved son. And it says that Jesus approached the woman and said, "Stop weeping." He wasn't telling her that it was wrong for her to grieve. Jesus knew better than that. What he was indicating to her is that he, the Lord, was about to eliminate the need for her to grieve. It says in verse 14, he approached and touched the bier. Now mind you, no one asked Jesus to resurrect the boy. Not even the mother asked him to do this. Jesus took the initiative because he was deeply moved at heart. And then it goes on to say, he resurrected this young man. Verse 15 says, the dead man sat up, started to speak. The expression sat up in Greek is sometimes used by ancient writers to describe a patient sitting up in bed. And it's used that way in the Bible at Acts chapter 9 in verse 40. And the account concludes with the most tender words of all. He gave him back to his mother. Jesus gave a son, a live son, back to his mother. Now, what does this account teach us about Jesus? What do we see in action here? Well, Jesus' love moved him to take the initiative to ease the grief of this woman. The question in view of our theme is this: do you know the love of the Christ in this respect? And only if, like Jesus, you take the initiative to ease the grief of others. But how can you do that? I mean, granted, we cannot resurrect the dead the way Jesus did. Nevertheless, there's much that we can do to ease the grief of others. What things? Well, to answer that, I'd like to share with you the results of an interview I conducted just this past week. I talked to a couple of different brothers and sisters who lost loved ones under very tragic circumstances. And I asked them, what did others do that helped you to cope with your grief? Let me share with you some of the answers. The first brother, his name is Ernie Garrett. I've mentioned him to you before. Ernie lost his son, an only child, to a terrorist attack back in December of 1988. His son was a flight attendant aboard the Pan Am jet that exploded in Scotland back in December of that year. And I asked Ernie, what have others done over the years that has helped you to cope? And he said a few things. He said, first, simple cards and letters really made a difference. And I asked him why. And Ernie said, because I reread them to this day, even though it's been 13 years since my son died. Ernie suggested something else. He said, don't necessarily avoid mentioning the deceased by name. He said, I appreciated it when others would mention my son Paul by name and tell me the things about him that they loved. And then Ernie added one other thing. He said, remember the anniversary of the death. He said, some still call us on the anniversary of Paul's death. It is so comforting to know that they still remember us. Simple things that can make a big difference for those who grieve. Let me tell you a little bit about Vicky Girano. If that name sounds familiar to you, it might be because their story appeared in the July 22nd wake of this year. Sister Girano and her husband lost their daughter a little over a year ago. She's the girl who was 9 months pregnant. She was murdered. And shortly after being murdered, her baby was taken from her womb. And that little baby is a little over a year old right now and doing very well. But I asked the mother, Vicki, what helped you to cook? What have others done that has made a difference for you? And Vicki mentioned several things I'd like to share with you. The first is, weep with people who weep, as Romans 12:15 says. He said, I appreciated it when friends came over and just cried with me. She also said something else. She said, hugs. Every time I walk into the Kingdom Hall, I get lots of hugs. And Vicki added one more thing. She said, ask the bereaved, would you care to talk about her? Ask, would you care to talk about your loved one who died? And Vicki explains why. She said, talking about Teresa keeps her alive in my mind and heart. Teresa's alive in Jehovah's memory, so I want to keep her alive in my memory. And it's recommended that you ask, because not all bereaved persons may want to talk at first. So why not simply ask, do you need to talk about them? Would you like to talk about it? And one final example, a sister named Teresa. I interviewed her some time ago. Her 1.5-year-old daughter was tragically killed in a car accident. And among the things that Teresa mentioned was a very simple gesture. And I think this illustrates that you don't have to do elaborate things. It can be very simple gestures that if you take the initiative can make a big difference for others who grieve. Teresa explained that after the funeral of her little daughter, when she and her husband came back to meetings at the Kingdom Hall, one of the most difficult things she found was sing the songs that the congregation used, and especially songs that mention the resurrection, and more especially the song, Keep Your Eyes on the Cross. Well, Teresa said that she would normally try to sit in the back so that if she started to break down during a song, she would be okay. She could maybe get to the restroom. Well, one time the meeting was crowded, so she ended up sitting toward the front. And that particular song was introduced, and they started to sing, and she started to sob. And she says this. A friend who was sitting across the aisle saw me crying. She came over, put her arm around me, and sang the rest of the song with me. I felt so full of love for the brothers and sisters and so happy that we got back to the meeting, realizing that that's where our help is, there at the Kingdom Hall. So granted, we can't resurrect the dead as Jesus did, but there's much that we can do to help ease the grief of others. And when you take the initiative to reach out to a bereaved person, and you see that in some small way, perhaps, you have made a difference, that you have helped this person to better cope with the pain at present, then, by experience, you will know the love that Jesus felt when he reached out to that widow and gave her back his son. Let's take a look at a second snapshot of Jesus' love, described in Matthew chapter 11. Jesus refreshed others rather than adding to their burdens. Matthew chapter 11, we'll start with verse 28. Incidentally, if you don't already know, Matthew 11:28 is the year text for the 2002 service year. Matthew chapter 11, we'll look at verse 28. Come to me, all you who are toiling and loaded down, and I will refresh you. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am mild-tempered and lowly in heart. And notice, you will find refreshment for your souls. For my yoke is kindly and my load is light. Let's analyze these words of Jesus for a moment. According to verse 28, Jesus addressed the people he was speaking to and described them as toiling and loaded down. What did he mean? Well, the word toiling here in the Greek is elsewhere in the New World Translation rendered weary. It's also rendered tire out It describes people who become weary as a result of heavy struggling. Now, Jesus also says in verse 28 that the people were loaded down. Literally in the Greek, it has the idea of being overloaded like a beast of burden. Now, why? What was loading down the people so much? Well, two things in particular. First, the religious leaders there in the first century burdened the people because they made religion a burdensome thing instead of a refreshing thing. But something else caused the people in Jesus' day to be toiling and loaded down. I think we can relate to it today. It's how difficult it was for people to eke out a living in the first century in that economy. For example, the average working man in Jesus' day toiled 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, in order to provide for his family. But to put into some perspective how difficult it was, according to some scholars, in the first century, a loaf of bread cost 1 hour's pay. A good cup of wine, 2 hours' pay. Now let me ask you, how much do you earn in an hour? You don't have to call it out. But could you imagine taking that amount of money to buy just 1 loaf of bread? A good cup of wine, how much do you earn in 2 hours? Imagine spending that much money for a simple cup of decent wine. Little wonder that people were toiling and loaded down in Jesus' day. Now in Matthew 11 there, 28, Jesus promised that he would refresh these people. What did he mean? The word refresh here in the original language simply means rest. Jesus offered them rest or relief, not just in the future, but in the present. You see, he showed them how to be free from those religious traditions that weighed them down. He also showed them how to find happiness and fulfillment in life. Now, these words at Matthew 11, 28 and 29, what do they teach us about Jesus' love? Simply this: love moved Jesus to refresh people rather than adding to their burdens. Now we might direct this next question in particular to those of us who have the privilege of serving as elders. And I'd like to ask this: elders, do you know the love of the Christ in this respect? Or put another way, elders, do you know what it feels like to bring refreshment to your brothers, to bring relief to your brothers? Why? Why refresh your brothers? It's very simple. Because so many of them, so many of us are toiling and loaded down. Let's face it, ever so many in the congregation are weary and overloaded. It's not getting easier to eke out a living in this system, to provide for your family, and at the same time not neglect spiritual things. And as I visit congregations in various parts of the country, I'm amazed at how many of our dear and faithful brothers and sisters struggle with feelings of guilt, feeling guilty about not being able to do more in pleasing God. Your brothers and sisters are toiling and loaded down. What can you do in their behalf? Imitate the love of Jesus by bringing them refreshment. How? How can we as elders refresh our brothers? The answer? By treating them in ways that comfort, relieve, and encourage them. Now let's consider 3 areas. First, when you teach at meetings, refresh your brothers. Granted, at times it may be necessary for the elders to stand up here on the platform and at the meetings. It might be necessary at times for them to offer some counsel. However, brothers, never forget that meetings are held primarily for another reason. Meetings are held primarily to upbuild and encourage the flock. So our talks, our parts, should be positive and scriptural. Otherwise, we are shortchanging our brothers. I illustrate the point this way. Imagine that you're in a desert and you're dying of thirst. You're just completely parched. And in the distance, you see what appears to be a body of water. And you start walking, and then you start crawling, and then you start dragging yourself there. And you reach down, and you pick up a handful of sand. It was all a mirage. Brothers, this place here and the meetings that we enjoy when we come here should not be a mirage. Our brothers and sisters have to crawl through the desert, some of them, in order to be here at congregation meetings. And when they do, and we stand up on this platform and we address them, what are we giving them? A handful of sand or refreshing waters of scriptural truth? You see, this place and what goes on here at our meetings should be an oasis, not a mirage. And it will be if at meetings we're mindful of refreshing ourselves. The second area, when shepherding. Often as elders, we're called upon to shepherd our brothers. We shepherd them by calling on them at their homes, by talking to them before and after the meetings, by working with them in the ministry and talking with them between the doors. When shepherding your brothers, remember, your job is to nourish and encourage the sheep. Period. See, we must believe in our brothers. We have to, as elders, believe that our brothers love Jehovah. And we have to trust that if they feel good about themselves, feel good about their relationship with Jehovah, that they'll want to give him their best. So our job when shepherding them is to help them to feel as good as they can feel, and then simply to trust that their hearts will do the rest. Third area, when trying to motivate your brothers to share in the ministry or to expand their share in the ministry, be mindful of the need to be refreshing. It's not our job to try to shame our brothers into doing more. It's not our job to induce a guilt trip so that they'll be motivated by guilt to do more. Let me illustrate it this way by telling you about an elder I knew of. I'm sure he was well-intentioned. But this elder, to encourage the pioneer ministry, would come to a congregation, and if he saw someone whom he felt should be doing more in the ministry, he would walk over and hand a pioneer application to that person. And then he would say this: you take this home and you talk to Jehovah about it. And if you can justify before God why you should not pioneer, then you don't have to fill it out. But if you cannot justify before Jehovah why you're not pioneering, then you give it back to me with your signature. Now let me ask you this. Even if the people here would fill out that application and hand it in, is Jehovah pleased with service that's motivated by guilt and shame? 2 Corinthians 9:7 says, God loves a cheerful giver. Jehovah wants service and worship that's motivated by love and joy, not guilt or shame. Now, besides, even if these individuals do get into the full-time service, what's going to happen a year from now or 2 years from now if their motive for sharing in this work is guilt rather than love? Now, mind you, to be sure, the full-time ministry is a rewarding way of life. It's a wonderful career. And it should be encouraged, highlighted, emphasized, but in a positive way, not a negative way. You see, the negative shame-based approach is not encouraging, it's not refreshing, and it's not even pleasing to God. You want to encourage pioneering? Find a positive way to do so. Let me illustrate the point this way. Imagine that a group of children are in a swimming pool, and it's a very hot day, and these kids are having the time of their life in that pool. But there's one child off on the side, and he's afraid to get into the water. Now, how do you get this child into the water? You could drag him over and throw him in the pool. You could push him in the pool. You could even try shaming him, embarrassing him, humiliating him in front of the others to get him into the pool. Or you might try this. You might try just directing his attention to all the fun that those other children are having in the pool. And before long, he just might want to get in on all the fun. You want to encourage the full-time ministry, brothers? Highlight the joys and blessings and rewards that come from being in the full-time ministry. And then trust that those whose hearts will motivate them will just want to get in on all that fun. The point is, refresh your brothers like Jesus did. Upbuild them, encourage them, reassure them. And then, when you see the relief in their eyes, and when you hear the appreciation in their voice, and when you see the results in their service to God, then you will know what Jesus felt when he refreshed others. You see, then, by experience, you will know the love of Christ. Let's take a look at another snapshot of Jesus' love in action. This had to do with the way Jesus treated women. Love moved Jesus to treat women with dignity and respect. And a beautiful example of this is found in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5. We'll start with verse 25. The setting here, Jesus was on his way to the home of Jairus, whose daughter was gravely ill. So Jesus was on an important mission. But something happened along the way that caused Jesus to take a pause. Mark chapter 5, starting with verse 25. Now there was a woman subject to a flow of blood, 12 years. She had been put to many pains by many physicians, and had spent all her resources and had not been benefited, but rather it got worse. When she heard the things about Jesus, she came behind in the crowd and touched his outer garment. For she kept saying, if I touch just his outer garment, I shall get well. And immediately her fountain of blood dried up, and she sensed in her body that she had been healed of the grievous sickness. Immediately also, Jesus recognized in himself that power had gone out of him. He turned about in the crowd and began to say, who touched my outer garments? But his disciples began to say to him, you see the crowd pressing in upon you, and do you say, who touched me? However, he was looking around to see her that had done this. But the woman, frightened and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told the whole truth. He said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be held from your grievous sickness. A beautiful description of Jesus treating a woman with dignity and respect. Let's take a closer look at the account. In verse 25, it says that she was suffering from a flow of blood. Now, according to the Mosaic law, such a condition would have affected not only her health, it also would have made her ceremonially unclean. So she should not have been in that crowd, for she risked touching others. And under the law, anyone she touched would also become unclean. But can you imagine going for 12 years of your life, perhaps, without touching or being touched? That might well be what this woman's predicament was. Now, she was desperate, because it says in verse 27 that she came behind him in the crowd. This was an embarrassing, a humiliating condition. But she was desperate because she risked touching others and making them unclean because she was absolutely convinced in her heart that Jesus could remove the source of her uncleanness. It says in verse 30 that after she touched him and was healed, that Jesus recognized or felt that the power had gone out of him. And we sometimes forget that all this healing that Jesus did drew on his vitality, depleted his power. And yet there are other places in the Gospels, for example, in Luke 6:19, it says that at times Jesus let whole crowds of people touch him in order to be healed. And it says in verse 32 that Jesus turned about in the crowd. Even though he was on his way to the home of this man whose daughter was seriously ill, it was a serious, important mission, Jesus stopped because he had to know who it was that touched him. And then it says in verse 32 that the woman came and threw herself at his feet and told him the whole truth. I mean, imagine what that meant for her. In front of this crowd of people, telling him the whole story about this very personal and embarrassing condition and what she had done so that she could just touch his garments. Now, what did Jesus do? Did he scold her for breaking the Mosaic law? Or technically, she had violated that law by being in the crowd? No. Ever compassionate, Jesus took into consideration her desperate circumstances and her faith. So Jesus looked beyond the letter of the law. He reaches out to her according to verse 34 and he says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." This is the only time in the Gospels that Jesus addressed a woman in this manner. And how that word must have put her heart at ease. Now, this wasn't the only time that Jesus treated women with dignity and respect. There were others. For example, he spoke to the Samaritan woman at the well. And yet Jesus had to know that according to rabbinic traditions in the first century, men were discouraged from women in public. But that didn't faze Jesus. He had a lengthy conversation with them. Jesus taught men and women. Men and women were among his disciples. For example, in the home of Lazarus, his sisters Martha, Mary, Jesus did not hesitate to teach the women on that occasion, even though he had to know that according to rabbinic traditions in the first century, women received very little in the way of religious education. In fact, according to the Jewish Mishnah, a man who taught his daughter a knowledge of the Mosaic law, it said, might as well teach her lechery. Lechery refers to lewd sexual behavior. Now, despite traditions like Jesus did not hesitate to teach women. And one more that I've always found very interesting is that following his resurrection, Jesus appeared first to his women disciples. And he instructed them to go and tell the apostles that he had been resurrected. And that despite the fact that according to rabbinic traditions in the first century, a woman could not even testify in a court of law. And here these women were going to testify one of the single greatest accomplishments in history, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And what does all of this tell us about Jesus? It tells us an important truth, friends. Jesus had a wholesome love for women. And that love moved him to treat women with dignity and respect. Well, brothers, here's a question for you and me. Do you know the love of the Christ in this respect? You can. Only if you treat women with dignity and respect. How? Consider three areas. First, in the home. A husband who respects his wife. A husband who loves his wife does not degrade or demean her, telling her she's fat, stupid, or ugly. A husband who truly loves his wife, does not deny her a voice in family decisions. A husband who truly loves his wife does not refuse to talk to her for days or weeks because she has upset or disappointed him in some ways. Rather, if he truly loves his wife, he dignifies her by valuing her opinions, her thoughts, and her feelings. The second area in the congregation. How can we dignify our sisters? Well, for one thing, by not overreacting if a sister takes appropriate initiative. I'll give you some examples. She sees a problem with a field service arrangement, and she speaks up. Maybe she hears the conductor telling someone to meet him at coordinates, and she knows that he's made a mistake. And rather than letting the group get lost, she speaks up tactfully. Or maybe she tells an elder about a sick or discouraged one in the congregation, and she says, you know what? Sister so-and-so, brother so-and-so could sure use a shepherding call. Why don't you give him a call? Or maybe it's a wife whose husband is conducting a meeting, and he keeps missing a particular hand, and she's sitting in the back, and she kind of signals to him a person who he's been missing. Now let me ask you this. Are such initiatives an affront to theocratic headship? Of course not. Let's not overreact because a sister takes appropriate initiative. And a third example, a third area, we can dignify our sisters by acknowledging the sacrifices and hard work that they put forward. For example, think for a moment about our dear sisters whose husbands serve as elders and the sacrifices that they make in order to share their husbands with the congregation. I mean, think about what that means. Now, these elders, they have jobs like normal people. They have to provide for a family. They come home, if they have children, there's the homework problems or the budget problems, the same challenges that all of us face. But then in addition to those things, these dear brothers have talks to prepare, hearts to prepare, shepherding calls to make, at times judicial matters to handle. Where does that time come from? It comes from their wives. It comes from their children who are making sacrifices in order to share their husband with the congregation. Now, how can we demonstrate that we appreciate those sacrifices? There are several things we can do. First, let's be considerate and thoughtful. I might illustrate that by telling you about something that has happened in our own home, and I'm sure some of the elders here might relate to that. Get a phone call one night, and Joanne and I, after dinner, we're just relaxing, watching some television. And Joanne answers the phone, and she hears this voice at the other end say, "Is Dave home?" And I can tell by the look on her face what's happened, so she hands me the call. And who is it? The person didn't say. And then it turns out it might be somebody in need of some assistance, maybe a discouraged soul, or somebody facing a problem or with a question, and that's understandable. But whatever happened to, hello, Joanne, how are you? I'm sorry to call you at home tonight, but there's something that just came up. May I please talk to Dave for just a moment? See, what's wrong with that? In most cases, she recognized the voice anyway. It's all a matter of being considerate and thoughtful. Something else we can do to show these dear sisters that we appreciate their sacrifice is not being unreasonable in what we expect from the elders. Not being unreasonable in what we demand from these brothers. I might illustrate this by telling you about something else that happened to us on one occasion. We got home from a meeting one Tuesday night. We have our school and service meeting on Tuesday night. And about 10 o'clock, we got home and the phone rings. And there's this brother on the phone. He says, listen, we're having a problem here. You've got to come over immediately. So I said, well, absolutely, I can be there in 10 minutes. He said, but let me ask you a question. Now, you know the situation, I don't. If it's something that must be handled tonight, I will be there in 10 minutes. But if it's something that could wait until tomorrow night, I could come over about 7. I said, oh, you can come tomorrow night. And I went the following night, and trust me, there was no problem in waiting. Let's not be unreasonable in what we expect from these brothers, recognizing that the time they give to us, they may have to take away from their wives and children. One more thing I might mention in this connection. Let's express our appreciation to these sisters who share their husbands with the congregation. And we had something that really touched us very deeply many years ago. This has only happened once in my life as an elder, but I'd like to tell you about it. About 20 years ago, maybe, after a meeting on a Sunday, we came out of the room, and the hall was empty, except for Joanne and someone else who was waiting with her for me. The sister, whose family I had just been helping, without any prompting, walked over to Joanne. She said, Joanne, I want to thank you for the time that your husband took from you to help me and my family today. And I want you to know that we appreciate it. And I can tell you this, that on the way home in the car, Joanne told me what the sister had said. And it's never happened again in all the years that I've been an elder. When Joanne told me what that sister said, Joanne added this. She said, I hope that in the future, if that sister and her family ever need help, that you will drop whatever you're doing and run to help them. That's how deeply she was touched by a very simple expression of appreciation. The point is, like Jesus, let us treat the women in our midst with the dignity and the respect that they deserve. If you do, you will touch their hearts and win their love and support. And when you see the way our dear sisters respond when they are treated with such dignity and respect, then you will know by experience what Jesus felt when he showed dignity and respect to the women he dealt with. How thankful we should be that Jehovah has included in his word a number of verbal snapshots of his son. Remember, space was limited, so Jehovah had to choose which photos to include. Obviously, he chose the ones that are dearest to him and that give us the clearest possible picture of his son. Now today, we've only considered 3 snapshots. Number 1, Jesus took the initiative to ease the grief of that widow. Number 2, he refreshed others rather than adding to their burdens. And number 3, Jesus had a wholesome love for women, and that love moved him to treat them with dignity and respect. Now remember, Jehovah included these photos, these snapshots, if you will, in his word, because he wants us to know the love of the Christ. So when we imitate the way Jesus showed love, that is, when we take the initiative to comfort those who grieve, when we as elders do our best to refresh our brothers rather than adding to their burdens, and when we treat the women in our midst with the dignity and the respect that they deserve, only then can we truly know by experience what it feels like to love others in the ways of Jesus.